She had stopped counting the days since Victor Stanislaus and his men had slaughtered the wagon train, carrying her west toward California. Was it 3 weeks, a month? Time had lost all meaning in this nightmare of captivity, where each dawn brought only the promise of fresh humiliation and the constant threat of worse to come. The memory of Aunt Margaret's fever-ravaged face, the sounds of dying horses screaming in their traces, the acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with prairie dust, and spilled blood, all of it had blurred into a waking nightmare that seemed to have no end. Now, at 18 years old, chained to a wagon wheel like livestock awaiting slaughter, she watched men debate her price, with the detached interest they might show a sack of grain or a bolt of fabric. Her green eyes, once bright with dreams of teaching children in sunny California classrooms, had dulled to the color of winter sage during the endless weeks of her captivity. She had learned not to look directly at her captors, had discovered through bitter experience that hope was more dangerous than despair, because it made you careless, made you believe that rescue might actually come from somewhere beyond this clearing in the middle of nowhere. Hope, she had learned, was a luxury she could no longer afford if she wanted to survive whatever came next. The November wind cut across the Dakota Territory clearing with the precision of a Lakota war blade, carrying the promise of early winter and whispers of the Black Hills gold rush that had shattered traditional hunting grounds like glass thrown against granite. Eliza pulled her torn shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the gesture provided little comfort against either the bone-deep cold or the predatory eyes of the men who studied her like merchants evaluating merchandise at a livestock auction. Her dress, once a respectable blue calico that her aunt had sewn for the journey west, now hung in tatters that barely preserved her modesty. Mud, and worse, stained the fabric, while tears in the sleeves revealed arms marked by rope burns and finger-shaped bruises that told their own story of casual cruelty and systematic intimidation. Her dark hair, which had once been her pride, hung in unwashed tangles around a face that had grown gaunt from irregular feeding and constant stress. But beneath the physical degradation, something harder than Black Hills granite remained unbroken in her core. A stubborn spark of defiance that 3 weeks of captivity had not yet managed to extinguish. She had watched other prisoners give up, had seen the exact moment when their spirits finally shattered and left behind only empty shells that ate when fed and moved when prodded. She would not become one of them, no matter what fresh horrors awaited her in the hands of whoever paid Victor's price. The assembled buyers represented Frontier Society's bottom-layer scarred claim jumpers, whose faces appeared on wanted posters in distant territorial capitals. Army deserters who had chosen crime over military discipline, and hardened criminals who saw kidnapped women as just another commodity to be bought, exploited, and discarded when their usefulness ended. They shifted nervously in the cold morning air, hands hovering near weapons, while their eyes performed crude calculations of value and potential profit. Victor Stanislaus paced back and forth in front of his human merchandise like a ringmaster presenting the main attraction at some obscene circus. The German trafficker's pale blue eyes held an excitement Eliza had never seen before. Not the casual brutality that had marked their daily interactions, but something approaching genuine anticipation that made her stomach clench with new dread. "Gentlemen," Victor announced in his thick accent, gesturing toward her with the same casual authority he might use to present a prize bull at a county fair. "Today we conclude what I believe will prove to be the most profitable transaction of my entire career in this territory. This specimen represents the finest quality merchandise available young unmarked by serious disease, and properly trained for household duties or other services as you see fit." The implications in Victor's voice made Eliza's skin crawl with revulsion and terror. She had overheard enough conversations during her captivity to understand that some fates were considerably worse than death, though death might come eventually anyway, for those unlucky enough to displease their new owners or fail to provide adequate return on investment. Dirty Dan, a young hothead who wore his gun too low and his temper even lower, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt and called out the first bid with the enthusiasm of someone who enjoyed inflicting pain for its own sake. $40 and 2 bottles of good Kentucky whiskey. $60 and a cavalry horse properly broken. Countered a scarred man whose pockmarked face spoke of diseases survived but not forgotten, his voice carrying the flat tones of someone accustomed to buying and selling human beings. Look at them childbearing hips, observed another buyer with the clinical interest of someone appraising breeding stock for a ranch operation. Could produce valuable workers for years to come, assuming proper care and regular breeding. Each comment hit Eliza like a physical blow to her remaining dignity. She closed her eyes and tried desperately to retreat into the mental fortress she had constructed during the worst moments of her captivity, a place where her father's voice still echoed with bedtime stories about brave princesses and noble knights, where her mother's gentle hands still braided her hair, for Sunday church services, where the familiar smell of her family's small Ohio farmhouse still meant safety and unconditional love. But that sanctuary crumbled like paper in rain, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made everyone in the clearing freeze like deer scenting a mountain lion on the wind. The rhythm was wrong for multiple horses. This was a single rider moving with purpose, but not apparent urgency, coming from the direction of the cottonwood grove that lined the nearby creek. A lone horseman emerged from the trees like something conjured from Eliza's most desperate prayers. Not the federal marshals that Victor constantly feared might discover his operation, but something that somehow seemed more dangerous to the assembled criminals, a Lakota warrior who sat his painted horse with the fluid grace of someone who had been born in the saddle and learned to fight before he could properly walk. Chayton's weathered face showed no emotion as his dark eyes swept the clearing with predatory intensity, missing nothing. Not the tension in Victor's posture. Not the way the buyer's hands drifted instinctively toward their weapons, and certainly not the young woman whose iron chains reflected the pale autumn sunlight, like accusations against everyone present in this mockery of civilized commerce. At 30 years old, he had survived enough frontier violence to recognize when a situation balanced on the knife's edge between negotiation and bloodshed. His buckskin jacket bore the geometric patterns traditional to his people's sacred symbols that had protected his grandfather at Little Bighorn, now worn with the quiet pride of someone who understood that survival required honoring the past while adapting to an uncertain future. The Henry rifle across his saddle pommel and the Colt revolver at his hip marked him as someone who understood that the Black Hills treaties meant nothing to men like these, that justice on the frontier came through strength rather than legal documents signed by politicians in distant Washington. He had been tracking Victor's trafficking operation for 6 months now, following a trail of missing children that led from his own people through a maze of forged documents, corrupt officials, and systematic brutality that reached far beyond simple criminal enterprise. The sight of this girl chained like an animal brought back memories he had tried to bury, memories of his sister Ayanna, taken by raiders when she was barely 15, her fate unknown, but easily imagined by anyone who understood the realities of frontier violence. Ayanna had been gathering telea berries near their summer camp when the attack came, their purple sweetness staining her fingers as she worked to fill the beaded pouch their grandmother had made for her coming-of-age ceremony. Chayton had been hunting with the other men, following elk sign into the high country, where the sound of gunfire from the valley below reached them too late to matter. By the time they returned, 3 teepees were burning, 2 elders lay dead, and his sister was gone, taken along with 4 other young women whose families would never see them again. That had been 8 years ago, but the memory still burned in his chest like coals from a sacred fire that would never quite die. He had sworn on his sister's memory to stop men like Victor Stanislaus, to ensure that other families would not suffer the loss that had carved a permanent hollow in his heart. Today, looking into this white girl's eyes and seeing the same terror that must have filled Ayana's during her final moments of freedom, he found himself making a decision that would change both their lives forever. I seek workers for winter preparation. Chayton announced his English precise, despite the slight accent that marked him as someone who had learned the white man's language out of necessity rather than choice. Strong backs for hauling firewood, mending equipment, preparing food stores. What is your price for this one? Victor's pale eyes gleamed with sudden opportunity. Indians paid in goods rather than asking inconvenient questions about provenance or legality, and this one looked prosperous enough to afford quality merchandise. More importantly, he appeared to have no interest in law enforcement complications or moral objections that might arise from purchasing human cargo. Prime beaver pelts that horse you ride and whatever weapons you carry. Victor replied, mentally calculating values while keeping his voice casual and businesslike. Fair price for healthy merchandise that will serve you well through the coming winter months. But even as Victor spoke, something was happening that would change everything about this transaction. From the tree line behind the main group, a figure had been watching the proceedings with growing horror and internal conflict that had been building for months. Percy Whitmore, territorial bailiff and reluctant participant in Marcel René's conspiracy, crouched behind a fallen log, with his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his official papers steady. Percy had been fighting with his conscience for weeks now, ever since Marcel had shown him the true scope of their operation, and made it clear that backing out would mean death not just for Percy, but for his wife and 2 young daughters back in Bismarck. What had started as simple document forgery justified in his mind as necessary, territorial development had evolved into systematic kidnapping, human trafficking, and what Marcel coldly described as extermination operations, disguised as legitimate business enterprises. The breaking point had come 3 days earlier, when Marcel had shown him detailed plans for expanding the operation throughout the entire American West, with Percy's forged documents providing legal cover for the systematic elimination of native populations and the enslavement of white settlers who posed potential obstacles to the conspiracy's goals. Looking at those maps, seeing the calculated coldness with which Marcel discussed the murder of thousands of innocent people, Percy had finally understood the true nature of what he had helped create. But Marcel held Percy's family hostage through threats that were anything but empty. 2 weeks ago, Percy's youngest daughter, Sarah, had disappeared from her school in Bismarck, only to be returned the next day, with a message that her continued safety depended entirely on her father's continued cooperation. The message had been delivered by one of Marcel's men, who had made it clear that Sarah's disappearance could become permanent if Percy showed any signs of developing a conscience about their business relationship. Now, watching this auction of human flesh, seeing the terror in a young woman's eyes, who looked so much like his own daughter might in a few years, Percy felt something break inside his chest. He couldn't save his own family by continuing to participate in this horror, but maybe he could save someone else's daughter while there was still time to matter. As Victor completed his negotiation with the Lakota warrior, Percy made a decision that would cost him his life, but might save his soul. Rising from concealment behind the fallen log, he stumbled into the clearing with his official papers clutched against his chest like armor that might protect him from what was coming. "Wait," Percy called out, his voice cracking with terror and desperate resolve. "There's been a change in the legal status of this merchandise." Victor spun toward him with murderous fury, understanding immediately that Percy's appearance meant the careful choreography of their operation had somehow gone wrong. "What are you doing here, you fool? You're supposed to be creating documentation for the Riverside shipment." "The documentation is already complete," Percy replied, his voice growing steadier as he committed himself fully to this path of no return. But federal marshals are mobilizing from Bismarck faster than we anticipated. We need to modify this transaction immediately to avoid legal complications that could expose our entire operation. As Percy spoke, he caught Eliza's eye and held her gaze for one crucial moment. In that instant, she saw something that made her heart skip with dangerous hope, not the cold calculation she had learned to expect from men in authority, but desperate guilt, mixed with a determination to make amends for crimes that had weighed on his conscience like stones in his chest. Moving with trembling hands, Percy approached Victor and whispered urgently in his ear, ostensibly discussing legal technicalities while actually positioning himself between the trafficker and his potential escape routes. What he said next would either save lives or get everyone in the clearing killed, but Percy had passed the point where personal safety mattered more than moral obligation. The Morrison girls' family debt has been legally challenged. Percy announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, pulling a genuine document from his vest with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Federal review has determined that the original charges were improperly filed. She must be released immediately to avoid federal investigation into our territorial debt collection procedures. Victor's face went white with rage and understanding. Percy wasn't just sabotaging this single transaction, he was threatening to expose the entire legal framework that Marcel had constructed to legitimize their trafficking operations. Without the protection of forged debt documents, their victims would be recognized as kidnapping targets, rather than legitimate collateral, bringing federal law enforcement down on their heads like the wrath of an avenging god. "You treacherous!" Victor began reaching for his pistol. But Percy had spent weeks planning for this moment. As Victor's gun cleared leather, the bailiff threw himself at Eliza's chains while simultaneously pressing a folded paper into her hands with desperate urgency. "Marcel René is your uncle." He gasped as Victor's bullet took him in the chest, spinning him around, but not stopping his final act of redemption. "Your father's brother. He's alive." The letter explains everything. Find Chayton, trust no one else. Percy Whitmore collapsed to the ground with blood frothing from his lips, but his sacrifice had accomplished what months of federal investigation had failed to achieve. The chains around Eliza's neck fell away as Victor fired again, this time missing entirely as panic overtook his usual cold precision. In the chaos that followed, with men shouting and weapons appearing from every direction, Chayton acted with the lightning reflexes that had kept him alive through 3 decades of frontier warfare. Spurring his horse forward, he swept Eliza up behind his saddle, while Victor's remaining men struggled to understand what had just happened and whether they should be fighting or fleeing. "Hold tight," Chayton commanded, feeling her arms wrap around his waist with desperate strength as they raced toward the broken country to the north. Dirty Dan's rifle shot went wide, splintering bark from a nearby cottonwood as they gained the safety of the first ridgeline. Behind them, angry shouts and more gunfire erupted as Victor's operation dissolved into chaos, but the Lakota warrior knew this territory in ways that white men could never hope to match. They rode hard through coulees carved by ancient floods and across frozen streams that reflected the gray November sky like mirrors of polished steel. Chayton used every piece of terrain to their advantage: creek beds that hid their passage, rocky ground that wouldn't hold hoofprints, ridge lines that allowed him to check their back trail while keeping them invisible to pursuit. When they finally stopped to rest near a hidden spring where centuries-old petroglyphs covered the stone walls like messages from forgotten ancestors, Eliza's hands still trembled uncontrollably as she touched her throat where the iron collar had been. The sensation of freedom felt so foreign after weeks of bondage that she almost couldn't believe it was real. "You are free now," Chayton said simply, offering her water from his own canteen while scanning the surrounding terrain for signs of pursuit. "No person owns another among my people. When you are strong enough to travel safely, you choose your own path according to your own heart." Eliza stared at him in confusion, unable to process words that contradicted everything she had learned about survival during her captivity. Men took what they wanted from women, especially men who had paid good money for the privilege. The idea that this warrior would rescue her without expecting payment in kind seemed too good to be true. "But you paid for me," she whispered, her voice hoarse from weeks of fear and insufficient water. "According to their law, you own me now. I saw you give Victor valuable goods in exchange for my person." "Their law means nothing to me," Chayton replied, checking the loads in his Henry rifle while keeping his eyes on the horizon where dust clouds might indicate approaching enemies. "I paid to remove you from immediate danger, nothing more. What happens next in your life is your choice to make, not mine or anyone else's." As he spoke, Chayton's eyes lingered on the ancient petroglyphs carved into the stone walls around their shelter. Circles within circles representing the sacred hoop of life thunderbird symbols promising protection from above. And handprints left by ancestors who had sheltered in this same place during their own times of danger and uncertainty. For a moment, he touched his own palm to one of the ancient prints, feeling the continuity of his people's presence in this land despite all the forces that sought to erase them. As they made camp that night in a sheltered canyon, where wind-carved walls provided protection from both weather and enemies, Eliza finally found the courage to reveal the secret she had guarded throughout her captivity. From a carefully sewn pocket hidden in the lining of her torn dress, she produced several pages torn from Victor's operational ledger, along with the document Percy had pressed into her hands during his final moments. "I stole these from Victor's record book at Rattlesnake Bar," she confessed, her voice carrying the guilt of someone who had learned that survival sometimes required desperate measures that contradicted everything she had been taught about honesty and respecting others' property. "When they forced me to clean the saloon during my first week of captivity, I saw Victor writing in this book every night after the customers left. One evening, he got drunk during a particularly intense card game and left it unattended on the bar. I thought, if I ever managed to escape, these pages might help prove what he was doing to people like me." Chayton studied the stolen documents by firelight, his expression growing darker with each line he read. The entries documented a systematic operation that made simple kidnapping look like child's play names, dates, locations, transportation routes, and most damning of all, regular payments to territorial officials for protection and legal cover that allowed the trafficking to continue without interference from law enforcement. "This reaches far beyond what I initially suspected," he murmured, pointing to entries that made his blood run cold with their implications. "Look at these names. Sheriff Owen from Willow Springs appears repeatedly in the payment records, along with territorial judges, federal Indian agents, and even military officers whose cooperation was purchased through regular bribes disguised as legitimate business transactions." Eliza felt her heart sink as she read over his shoulder. They had hoped to find allies in law enforcement, but if Sheriff Owen was compromised. "Can we trust anyone?" She whispered, the weight of their isolation settling over her like a burial shroud. "Perhaps," Chayton said grimly, though doubt flickered in his dark eyes. "Or perhaps Owen's involvement is more complex than it appears. Men sometimes play dangerous games to catch bigger prey. And Percy Whitmore's signature appears on dozens of forged debt documents," Eliza added, unfolding the letter the dying bailiff had given her. "But look at what he wrote here just before he tried to save me." The letter was hastily written but clear in its implications. "Miss Morrison, if you are reading this, then I have likely paid the price for my conscience with my life. Your uncle Marcel René is not dead as your family believes. He faked his disappearance 15 years ago to escape family obligations and build a criminal empire based on systematic exploitation of frontier conflicts. Your kidnapping was not random. It was ordered by Marcel as a test of our expanded operations. He knew your father would never recognize him after so many years of deliberate disguise, and your capture provided perfect cover for future operations targeting entire families. The documents I have hidden in the Willow Springs Bank contain proof of everything: forged territorial seals, blank debt certificates, correspondence with federal officials who have been bought and paid for. Marcel's ultimate goal is the complete extermination of native populations throughout the American West, opening vast territories for development by his business partners. Find Chayton the Lakota tracker. He has been hunting our operation for months and represents your best hope for survival and justice. Trust no one else. The corruption reaches higher than you can imagine. May God forgive me for what I helped create. Percy Whitmore, Territorial Bailiff, November 15, 1878. Marcel René. Eliza whispered the name falling from her lips, like a curse she had never expected to utter. My father's younger brother. He disappeared when I was 10 years old during what was supposed to be a routine business trip to Denver. The family held a funeral service when his business partners reported finding blood and torn clothing near a known bandit crossing. We mourned him for months. My father never got over losing his only brother. Now we know he chose to disappear, Chayton said grimly. Chose to let his family believe he was dead while he built a new life based on the systematic murder of mine. The implications were staggering and deeply personal for both of them. Eliza's own uncle had orchestrated her kidnapping as part of a business plan, while Chayton's missing sister might well have been one of Marcel's early victims, taken to test methods that would later be refined and expanded throughout the territory. There's something else in Victor's records. Chayton continued studying the stolen pages with growing concern. References to someone called the Federal Observer, who receives monthly payments for misdirecting investigation into territorial irregularities. That suggests corruption reaches all the way to Washington, with federal officials being paid to ensure that no one looks too closely at what's happening out here. Their horrifying discoveries were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, moving through the darkness with the careful precision of men who knew they were hunting dangerous quarry. But instead of Victor's remaining gang members seeking revenge, they found Dr. Frederick leading a small group from Willow Springs, their faces grim with urgent purpose that suggested news rather than hostility. I thank goodness you're both safe. The elderly physician called out his medical bag, prominently displayed to indicate peaceful intentions, while his horse showed signs of hard riding through difficult country. We received word about Percy Whitmore's death and the federal raid on Victor's operation through our telegraph operator. Percy made it to town before he succumbed to his wounds, told us you'd have evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy before he died. Something in Dr. Frederick's tone and the specificity of his knowledge made Chayton's warrior instincts flare with warning signals honed by 30 years of frontier survival. The doctor knew too much about their location, and activity spoke too confidently about events he shouldn't have detailed knowledge of, and his arrival felt orchestrated rather than coincidental. Harkars, how did you know exactly where to find us, Dr. Frederick? Chayton asked carefully, his hand drifting casually toward his rifle, while maintaining the appearance of relaxed conversation. This canyon is not marked on any territorial maps, and few white men know of its existence. The physician's smile seemed genuine, but his answer came too quickly, too smoothly, like something rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Percy was very specific about your likely route of travel before he lost consciousness from his wounds. He said you'd almost certainly head for the old Lakota winter camp near Owl Creek to seek shelter and medical attention for any injuries sustained during your escape. A chill ran down Chayton's spine that had nothing to do with the November wind. I never told Percy Whitmore about our seasonal camps, he said quietly, his voice carrying deadly certainty that made everyone present understand how drastically the situation had just changed. Few white men know of our traditional gathering places, and certainly no territorial officials have ever been given such information. The truth hit them both like ice water thrown in their faces. Dr. Frederick wasn't there to provide medical assistance or offer sanctuary. He was there to capture them for Marcel René, using his reputation and medical authority as cover for what amounted to kidnapping on behalf of the conspiracy they had just exposed. Dr. Frederick's shoulders sagged as his deception crumbled, and for the first time since Eliza had known him, the elderly physician looked every one of his 60-plus years. His weathered hands shook as he set down his medical bag with careful precision. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of crushing guilt and desperate fear. "I'm genuinely sorry about this," the doctor said, and his regret appeared absolutely authentic, even as his companions raised their weapons with practiced efficiency. "Marcel has been holding my granddaughter Sarah for 3 weeks now. She's only 7 years old, and she's all the family I have left in this world since my son died in that mining accident last spring." Marcel showed me a lock of her hair still tied with the blue ribbon I gave her for her birthday. Said the next package would contain one of her fingers if I failed to cooperate completely with his instructions. The doctor's voice broke slightly as he continued, tears running down his weathered cheeks. He made it clear that Sarah's continued safety depends entirely on my ability to deliver both of you alive and unharmed to his headquarters at the old Quicksilver mine. I know this makes me a criminal and a traitor to everything I've spent my life believing in, but she's just a little girl who's never hurt anyone. I can't let her die because of my failure to follow orders. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring in winter wind, with both sides calculating odds and looking for advantages that might tip the balance toward survival. Dr. Frederick's men were positioned professionally, but they seemed reluctant to use violence against their targets, a hesitation that might provide an opening if circumstances shifted in the right direction. Before anyone could make a move that would turn negotiation into bloodshed, Sheriff Owen's authoritative voice cut through the tension like an axe through kindling, coming from a direction that none of them had expected. "Drop your weapons immediately, all of you, and step away from your prisoners." Owen emerged from the tree line with 6 well-armed deputies, their movements coordinated with the precision that came from years of working together in dangerous situations. But instead of pointing their guns at Chayton and Eliza, as everyone expected, they surrounded Dr. Frederick's group with the efficiency of professionals executing a carefully planned arrest. Sheriff Owen. Dr. Frederick's confusion was absolutely genuine, his weathered features reflecting complete bewilderment at this unexpected development. But Marcel specifically told me that you were part of his organization, that you'd been taking his money for months to provide protection and misdirection for his operations throughout your jurisdiction. Eliza felt her heart leap with desperate hope, then plummet with renewed fear. If Owen was here to arrest Dr. Frederick, did that mean he was truly on their side? Or was this another layer of Marcel's elaborate deception? Owen's weathered face remained impassive as he studied the elderly physician. For a long moment, his gray eyes held no warmth, no reassurance, only the cold calculation of a lawman weighing his options. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an authority that made everyone present straighten unconsciously. "Marcel René says many different things to many different people." Owen said slowly, his hand resting casually on his holstered revolver. "Most of them carefully calculated lies, designed to make honest folks do his dirty work while keeping their own hands clean of direct involvement in the worst crimes." But even as relief began to flood through Eliza's chest, Owen's next words made her blood freeze. "Unfortunately for you, Dr. Marcel wasn't lying about my involvement in his operation. The world seemed to tilt sideways as Owen's deputies shifted their positions, weapons now trained on Chayton and Eliza, while Dr. Frederick's men looked uncertain about whose orders to follow in this rapidly changing situation. "You see," Owen continued with the calm satisfaction of a man revealing a carefully guarded secret, "Marcel's operation has been extremely profitable for everyone involved, including local law enforcement. The territorial government pays handsomely for maintaining order and ensuring that problematic populations don't interfere with legitimate business development." Chayton's hand inched toward his rifle. But Owen's deputies were professionals, and any sudden movement would result in immediate death for both of them. "However," Owen said, and something in his tone made everyone pause, "Marcel made one crucial mistake in his planning." The sheriff reached into his vest and produced a small, worn photograph that he held up for everyone to see. Even in the flickering firelight, they could make out the image of a young Lakota woman with kind eyes and traditional braided hair. "This is my wife, Winona," Owen said quietly, using the Lakota name with perfect pronunciation that spoke of years of practice and genuine affection. "She was taken by raiders 8 years ago while gathering berries near her family's summer camp. Marcel's raiders." Eliza felt her breath catch as understanding crashed over her like a mountain avalanche. Chayton's face went rigid with recognition and hope so fragile it hurt to witness. "Ayanna." Chayton whispered his sister's name barely audible, but carrying the weight of 8 years of grief and desperate searching. "She survived," Owen said simply. "Marcel kept her alive because educated Native women could command higher prices from certain types of buyers. But she managed to escape during transport to Denver, made her way back north, and eventually found me. We've been married for 6 years now. She's the one who's been helping me track Marcel's operation from the inside." The revelation hit them like lightning illuminating a storm-darkened landscape. Owen wasn't just another corrupt lawman, he was a man whose life had been shattered by Marcel's crimes, and then rebuilt around the quest for justice and revenge. My name appearing in Victor's ledgers was part of a carefully constructed deception. Owen continued, his voice growing harder with each word. Marcel needed to believe he had local law enforcement under his control, so I allowed him to think his bribes were purchasing my cooperation while actually feeding him false information and documenting every aspect of his operation for federal authorities. Dr. Frederick's knees buckled with relief so profound it was almost physical, and Owen caught his arm to steady him. "Your granddaughter Sarah has been safe in the church basement for 2 weeks now, Doc, under federal protection that Marcel doesn't know about. We've been feeding him false information about her location to track the extent of his network and identify everyone who might be compromised by his threats or bribes. Sarah's really safe." Dr. Frederick's voice cracked with desperate hope. "You're not just saying that too. She's been asking for her grandfather every day." Owen assured him with genuine warmth that transformed his weathered features. "Playing with the other rescued children and helping the church ladies with their sewing projects. She's been worried about you, wondering why you haven't come to visit her like you usually do every Sunday after services." The revelation that Owen was actually working against Marcel rather than for him shifted the entire dynamic of their situation. But their moment of relief and growing hope was cut short by the thunder of approaching hoofbeats from multiple directions. Victor's remaining gang members, reinforced by Marcel's private army of hired guns and corrupt territorial officials, had tracked them down for what would clearly be a final decisive confrontation. "Marcel René sends his personal regards." Victor's voice carried across the clearing with mockery as thick as molasses and twice as bitter, coming from a position of strength that suggested careful planning rather than impulsive revenge. The German trafficker emerged from the tree line with more than a dozen heavily armed men, their weapons trained on the small group gathered around the hidden spring. But Victor's usual confidence seemed forced and brittle, and Eliza noticed that his left hand was heavily bandaged. Apparently, Percy Whitmore's final act of defiance had cost the trafficker more than just strategic surprise. "Your uncle also sends a special message, Miss Morrison." Victor continued with savage pleasure that revealed how much he was enjoying this moment of apparent triumph. But before he could deliver whatever cruel revelation Marcel had prepared, the battle erupted with the sudden violence of a prairie thunderstorm. This wasn't the casual violence Eliza had witnessed during her captivity, the brutal but businesslike brutality of men who saw her as valuable property to be preserved for profitable sale. This was something far more dangerous, and the desperate, vicious fury of criminals fighting for their very survival against forces that threatened to expose years of systematic corruption and murder. They fought a running engagement through increasingly broken country, using dry arroyos carved by ancient floods and wind-carved rock formations for cover, as Marcel's superior numbers tried to surround and overwhelm them through coordinated tactical movements. The metallic taste of gunpowder mixed with the copper tang of blood and the acrid smell of fear sweat as bullets whined through the darkness like angry wasps seeking human flesh. Chayton moved through the terrain, like something born to it, employing traditional Lakota warfare tactics that turned every piece of landscape into either weapon or shield, using his intimate knowledge of the ground to negate the enemy's numerical advantage. His rifle spoke with deadly precision, each shot carefully aimed and timed to maximize damage, while conserving ammunition they couldn't afford to waste. Dr. Frederick, his shame at being manipulated, transformed into righteous fury at Marcel's threats against innocent children, proved surprisingly capable with the rifle Owen provided him. Years of frontier medicine had given him steady hands and nerves that remained calm under extreme pressure skills that translated surprisingly well to combat situations where precision and coolness under fire could mean the difference between life and death. Sheriff Owen coordinated their defensive movements with the professional competence of someone who had survived numerous gun battles during his years of legitimate law enforcement, before Marcel's bribes had corrupted him into participation in the conspiracy. His knowledge of tactics and terrain proved invaluable in keeping their small group alive against overwhelming odds. The air filled with the hellish symphony of combat, the sharp crack of rifle fire echoing off canyon walls, the whistle of ricocheting bullets striking stone, the wet slap of lead finding human flesh, and underneath it all the labored breathing of people pushed beyond their normal limits of endurance and courage. The old silver mine. Owen shouted during a brief lull in the fighting blood running from a bullet graze across his forehead, but his eyes still sharp with tactical awareness and desperate determination. Victor's established some kind of operational headquarters at the abandoned Quicksilver workings. Marcel's there too, along with whatever's left of their command structure and the evidence we need to expose the entire conspiracy. And my nephew. Chayton added his voice, carrying deadly calm that somehow conveyed more menace than any amount of shouting or cursing could have achieved. They took 8-year-old Noden from our winter camp 2 days ago. If they've harmed him in any way, I'll make Victor's death last considerably longer than he can possibly imagine. The mention of the kidnapped child galvanized everyone present. Dr. Frederick's face went white with the memory of his own granddaughter's supposed captivity, while Sheriff Owen's jaw tightened with the particular rage that lawmen reserved for crimes against children. "Then we end this tonight," Owen declared. "No more running, no more hiding, no more letting them dictate the terms of engagement. We take the fight directly to them and finish it permanently, whatever the cost might be." The assault on Quicksilver Mine began at midnight, under skies so dark they seemed to swallow light itself, with clouds blocking even the faint illumination of stars. and turning the world into a maze of black shadows and deadly possibilities. The abandoned silver workings loomed against the hillside, like the maw of some ancient beast awakened by their approach and hungry for whatever sacrifice they might offer to its eternal appetite for violence and death. Flickering torchlight from within the mine entrance cast dancing shadows across walls carved from living rock by men seeking wealth that had ultimately eluded them, leaving behind only dangerous passages, unstable supports, and the kind of desperate emptiness that attracted criminals seeking places to hide their worst crimes from civilized scrutiny. Ancient mining equipment scattered around the entrance created a maze of rusted machinery that had once promised fortune, but now served only as cover for men planning violence under cover of darkness. Steam-powered ore crushers stood silent and corroded like mechanical tombstones, while abandoned rail tracks disappeared into tunnels that led deep into the hillside's rocky heart, and their steel rails gleaming with moisture that dripped constantly from unseen sources above. Chayton led their small assault force through a concealed secondary entrance he had discovered during daylight reconnaissance, moving through narrow passages that branched and twisted through the hillside like arteries in some vast underground body. The abandoned workings stretched for hundreds of yards through solid rock, creating a three-dimensional maze of interconnected tunnels that had once housed silver extraction operations, but now harbored something far more precious than any mineral wealth, the evidence and witnesses needed to destroy a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial and federal government. Moving through the tunnels required extreme caution and intimate knowledge of underground dangers that could kill the unwary instantly and without warning. Ancient support timbers groaned ominously under stresses they were never designed to bear, their wood dried to tinder by years of abandonment and ready to collapse at the slightest disturbance. Flooded shafts created hidden death traps that could swallow a man whole before he had time to cry out for help, while their black water reflecting torchlight, like the eyes of underground predators waiting patiently for the unwary. The air itself was questionable, carrying the metallic taste of deep earth, mixed with lingering traces of mercury and other chemicals used in ore processing years earlier. Each breath felt thick and unnatural, while the constant sound of dripping water created an acoustic environment that made it impossible to distinguish between natural settling and the footsteps of approaching enemies. Water dripped constantly from unseen sources in the darkness above, creating pools that reflected their torchlight and masked the sound of approaching footsteps. The tunnels themselves seemed alive with echoes that could be footsteps, voices, or simply the mountain settling into configurations that had been disturbed by decades of mining operations. They moved in single file through passages barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, communicating through hand signals and facial expressions that had to be interpreted in flickering light that made everything uncertain and potentially threatening. Every step forward took them deeper into enemy territory, closer to a confrontation that would determine not just their individual fates, but the future of an entire region. The first chamber they encountered was empty, except for abandoned mining tools and evidence of recent habitation blankets still holding the warmth of human bodies, food scraps that attracted underground scavengers, and ammunition boxes that suggested Victor's men had been using the mine as a base of operations for several weeks. Maps tacked to the wall showed planned expansion routes throughout Dakota Territory and beyond, with red marks indicating targets for future operations that would dwarf their current activities in scope and systematic brutality. They found Noden in the second chamber, a larger space that had once housed the mine's main ore processing equipment. The 8-year-old was tied to a support beam but appeared physically unharmed beyond the psychological trauma of kidnapping and imprisonment in darkness. His dark eyes widened with desperate relief and hope when his uncle materialized from the tunnel shadows like an avenging spirit sent by their ancestors to restore balance to the world. Miss Uncala, The boy whispered urgently, using the traditional term of respect for his mother's brother, his voice carrying the kind of controlled terror that came from someone too young to fully understand his danger, but old enough to know that adult anger could turn deadly without warning. "They said terrible things about you, told me you had betrayed our people for white man's gold, and that's why the soldiers came to our winter camp. But I didn't believe them. I knew you would come." Some lies are crafted specifically to hurt more than any physical wound could. Chayton replied, gently cutting his nephew's bonds with swift, careful movements, while checking for injuries that might not be immediately visible. "But we know who we are, and what we stand for, regardless of what enemies might say about us to serve their own purposes." "They have maps, Uncle." Snowden continued as circulation returned to his hands and feet, his young voice carrying information that made the adults exchange grim glances. Maps showing places where they plan to take more of our people, more white families too. And they talked about someone important coming tonight, someone they called the Big Boss, who would decide what to do with all the prisoners they've been collecting. Their reunion was interrupted by Victor's voice echoing through the tunnel system with supernatural amplification that made his words seem to come from everywhere and nowhere. At once a disembodied threat that filled the underground spaces with malevolent purpose and the promise of violence that would make their previous encounters look like children's games. "I know you're down here somewhere, savage." The German's shout carried murderous rage and desperation, in equal measure distorted by the tunnel acoustics into something barely recognizable as human speech. "You've cost me everything I built over 5 years of careful work in this territory. Now your family reunion ends permanently, starting with that boy's screams echoing through these tunnels until everyone hiding in the darkness understands what happens to those who interfere with legitimate business operations." But instead of Victor appearing to carry out his threats, they found Marcel René waiting in the mine's main chamber, and the sight of him confirmed Eliza's worst fears about family betrayal, reaching depths she had never imagined possible. He stood beside a table laden with documents, maps, and what appeared to be detailed plans for expanding his operations throughout the entire American West, his presence transforming this underground criminal headquarters into something resembling a legitimate business office, where men in expensive suits made decisions that affected thousands of lives, with the same casual indifference they might show toward livestock or crop rotation. Marcel had their father's eyes and their grandfather's strong jaw, but 20 years of systematic cruelty had etched lines of calculation and contempt that transformed familiar features into something monstrous. His expensive clothes were perfectly clean. Despite the underground environment, his manicured hands showed no signs of physical labor, and his bearing suggested someone accustomed to giving orders rather than carrying them out personally. A gold pocket watch hung from a chain across his vest, its surface engraved with the family crest that Eliza remembered from her childhood. A symbol that had once meant safety and belonging, now corrupted into something that represented the opposite of everything she had been taught about honor and responsibility. When he looked at Eliza, his smile held genuine warmth that made her skin crawl with revulsion and disbelief. This was family blood of her blood, raised in the same household, taught the same values, but those connections seemed to mean nothing to someone who had chosen wealth over human decency. "Hello, dear niece," Marcel said, as if greeting a favorite relative at a pleasant family gathering, rather than confronting a kidnapping victim in an underground criminal stronghold. As he spoke, he absently brushed a speck of dust from his perfectly pressed sleeve, the gesture revealing his complete disconnection from the chaos and violence that surrounded his operation. "You've grown into quite the remarkable young woman since I last saw you playing with corn-husked dolls in your father's farmyard. My father died believing his brother was murdered by frontier bandits. Eliza replied, her voice carrying the weight of 3 weeks' worth of suppressed rage, mixed with the fresh shock of discovering the truth about her parents' deaths. He mourned you as an innocent victim while you built an empire on blood money. Marcel's response came with a slight adjustment to his gold cufflinks, the precious metal-catching torchlight, as he arranged his appearance with the same care he might use preparing for a business meeting in Denver's finest hotel. Your father was an idealistic fool who chose poverty and obscurity over opportunity and advancement. He said without heat or defensiveness, as if explaining basic facts to a slow child who needed simple concepts repeated for comprehension. What you call advancement, others call murder. Chayton's voice carried the kind of controlled fury that made even hardened criminals step back involuntarily. Marcel turned to study the Lakota warrior with clinical interest, like a naturalist examining an interesting specimen. I call progress inevitable and profitable for those wise enough to position themselves advantageously. He gestured to the maps and documents covering his makeshift desk, his pride in his accomplishments evident despite the criminal nature of his achievements. Look at what I've built through vision and determination transportation networks that span 3 territories, government contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, political influence that reaches from local sheriffs to federal senators. Built on the bodies of children. Dr. Frederick interrupted his voice, carrying moral outrage that reflected his profession's commitment to preserving life rather than exploiting it. Built on necessary population adjustments and resource reallocation. Marcel corrected with clinical precision that revealed how completely he had rationalized his crimes. As he spoke, he straightened a map on his desk, with the same meticulous attention to detail he might give to arranging flowers in a parlor. The question was never whether native populations would be displaced by American expansion. That outcome was determined by superior technology organization and economic systems. You're talking about wiping entire peoples from the land, Eliza said quietly, the words falling between them like stones dropped into still water. Marcel paused in his paper shuffling, fixing her with eyes that held no recognition of shared humanity. I'm talking about inevitability. Civilization requires difficult choices about resource allocation and population management. The casual way Marcel discussed mass murder as if it were crop rotation or livestock management struck Eliza with revelations about how thoroughly her uncle had abandoned any recognition of shared humanity. This wasn't simple greed or even calculated cruelty. This was something worse. A complete rejection of moral considerations in favor of abstract theories about progress that justified any atrocity as long as it served larger economic goals. Chayton stepped forward, his presence filling the chamber with barely controlled violence that made torchlight flicker as if responding to his inner fire. Where is my sister? Ah, yes, Ayanna. Marcel said, consulting a leather-bound ledger with the same attention he might give to reviewing shipping manifests. Quite successful in Denver society, I'm told. Some men pay handsomely for exotic companionship, especially when properly trained in domestic arts and social graces suitable to their elevated status. The words hit Chayton like physical blows. But before he could respond with the violence that Marcel's revelation demanded, Eliza's voice cut through the underground chamber with crystalline clarity. So you had our parents killed to protect your investment. Marcel looked up from his ledger, momentarily surprised by her directness, then smiled with what appeared to be genuine appreciation for her intelligence. I eliminated potential obstacles to necessary development. Your parents possessed information about my business associates in Denver that could have complicated our expansion into Colorado territory. Marcel's admission that he had ordered his own brother's murder was delivered with the same tone he might use to discuss shipping schedules or inventory management. Their deaths were regrettable, but necessary business decisions carefully planned to appear as random frontier violence rather than targeted elimination of specific threats to operational security. "You killed them," Eliza whispered, the full weight of betrayal crushing down on her like a mountain avalanche. "Your own brother, his wife, people who loved you, who mourned you. I made difficult but necessary choices." Marcel interrupted his attention, already returning to his documents, as if the conversation had become tedious. Sentiment is a luxury that successful businessmen cannot afford. The family confrontation that had been building through months of investigation and weeks of desperate flight was interrupted by a sound that made everyone in the chamber freeze with primitive terror. The distant rumble of collapsing rock echoing through the tunnel system like the growl of some enormous predator awakening from centuries of slumber. The mine's ancient support structure, weakened by years of abandonment and the stress of their running battles above ground, was finally surrendering to time and pressure that had been building since the last miners had departed 5 years earlier. Somewhere in the depths below them, tons of rock and earth were shifting into new configurations that threatened to bring down the entire hillside in a cascade of stone and timber that would bury them all beneath the mountain's weight. "Everyone clear the area immediately." Dr. Frederick shouted, his medical training automatically assessing the situation for maximum survival probability as dust began raining from the ceiling in increasing quantities. The whole mountains becoming unstable. But Victor had prepared for exactly this contingency, understanding that federal raids or rival criminal organizations might eventually force him to abandon his headquarters under circumstances that required destroying evidence and eliminating witnesses. As they raced toward the main entrance, the German trafficker triggered crates of Nobel's dynamite he had planted throughout the tunnel system as insurance against capture or betrayal. The blast that followed brought down sections of the hillside in a cascade of falling stone and splintered timber that threatened to bury everyone alive in the darkness. The explosion's concussion wave knocked them all to the ground, while clouds of choking dust made breathing nearly impossible and visibility almost zero. The sound itself was beyond human comprehension, a roar that seemed to come from the earth's very core, drowning out screams and prayers alike in its overwhelming fury. Fires spread from the blast's ignition point, feeding hungrily on ancient wooden supports that had been dried by decades of underground air circulation. The flames created an inferno that filled the remaining passages with smoke thick enough to kill through suffocation alone, while simultaneously consuming the oxygen they needed to survive their underground ordeal. The heat rose rapidly from merely uncomfortable to genuinely dangerous, making each breath feel like inhaling molten metal, while sweat poured from their bodies in streams that would quickly lead to dehydration and collapse. But the explosion had also torn openings in the hillside that connected to a parallel network of older mine shafts and ventilation passages. Through these gaps came another danger wolves that had been hunting in the area when the violence started following winter instincts that led them toward opportunities presented by human conflict. The blast had driven them into the secondary tunnels where they became trapped, confused, and increasingly desperate as smoke began filling their refuge. When the group was forced to retreat through these older passages to escape the main fire, they encountered the pack in a narrow ventilation shaft that represented the only viable escape route. The wolves' yellow eyes reflected torchlight, like demonic spirits as they faced the humans in the confined space. Their gray fur singed by smoke and their behavior made erratic by fear, hunger, and the disorientation of finding themselves trapped underground. The wolves were as confused and terrified as the humans, but their fear made them defend their position, rather than seeking escape routes that might lead them back to familiar territory above ground. In the narrow confines of the shaft, There was no room for either species to avoid the other, creating a desperate battle for passage that pushed everyone beyond their normal limits of endurance and sanity. Chayton fought with his rifle in the confined space, each shot echoing like thunder, while he tried to clear a path without bringing down what remained of the tunnel's ceiling. His left arm hung at an unnatural angle, where wolf fangs had found their mark, tearing through buckskin and flesh with the efficiency of weapons designed by nature for exactly this purpose. But he continued moving with grim determination that refused to acknowledge pain or the possibility of defeat. Sheriff Owen's revolver spoke repeatedly as he covered their retreat, his shots carefully aimed to avoid ricochets in the stone-walled passage. Each bullet had to count, ammunition was limited, and every shot that missed its target was a step closer to being overrun by creatures that felt no fear of human weapons and understood only the ancient law of survival through violence. Dr. Frederick, despite his age and medical training that emphasized preserving life, found himself forced to use violence to protect the children they were trying to rescue from this underground nightmare. His hands, which had spent decades healing wounds, now inflicted them with grim necessity as he fought to keep young Noden safe from fangs that could tear a child's throat open in seconds. When a burning timber crashed down and pinned Dr. Frederick beneath its crushing weight, Eliza faced a choice that would define her character forever. The physician's legs were trapped beneath wood that glowed like coals from hell. Blood was running from his mouth where internal injuries made breathing increasingly difficult, and the spreading fire was making the air almost unbreathable for everyone in their vicinity. "Leave me." Dr. Frederick gasped, his words barely audible above the crackling of flames and the distant growls of wolves that seemed to be getting closer with each passing second. The old physician's face was gray with pain and blood loss, but his eyes remained clear and focused on the larger picture of survival. Get that boy to safety. He's got his whole life ahead of him. Not without you. Eliza insisted, though, even as she spoke the words with desperate determination. She could feel the heat from spreading fires, making the air almost too hot to breathe safely. The smoke was getting thicker, each breath requiring conscious effort, while her eyes streamed tears that had nothing to do with emotion. Before she could be forced to choose between the doctor's life and the boy's safety, Chayton appeared through the smoke like an avenging spirit, his buckskin jacket singed and his left arm hanging useless where wolf fangs had torn muscle and possibly broken bone. Blood ran freely from multiple wounds, but his eyes remained focused on survival rather than acknowledging pain that would have incapacitated most men. The main shaft's completely blocked, he reported grimly, his voice strained, but still functional, despite the smoke inhalation and physical trauma. We've got maybe 60 seconds before the fire reaches Victor's powder stores in the lower levels, and when that happens, this entire hillside is going to come down like an avalanche. Working together with desperate efficiency born of absolute necessity, they managed to free Dr. Frederick from the burning timber, though the effort cost them precious time and exposed them to additional smoke inhalation that left everyone coughing and struggling to breathe. The physician's legs were badly crushed, making it impossible for him to walk without assistance. But he was alive and conscious enough to help guide their escape through passages he had studied during their initial entry. The explosion that followed when flames finally reached Victor's hidden stores of black powder shook the entire hillside like an earthquake, bringing down thousands of tons of rock in a cascade that could be heard for miles across the Dakota territory. The sound was beyond human comprehension, a rumble that seemed to come from the earth's very core, followed by the crash of falling stone that made the mountain itself seem to scream in agony. They made it out through a side passage with literally seconds to spare, carrying Dr. Frederick between them as the mine entrance collapsed in a thunderous roar that marked the permanent end of Victor's underground headquarters and criminal operations. The night air felt like salvation itself after the smoke-filled hell of the tunnels though their ears rang with the aftermath of the explosion, and their lungs burned from inhaling superheated gases and particulate matter. When the dust finally settled and the echoes faded into silence, Victor Stanislaus was gone forever, buried beneath the avalanche, along with his detailed records, his dreams of expanding the trafficking operation throughout the American West, and any hope of recovering the evidence that might have implicated other members of Marcel's conspiracy who had managed to avoid direct involvement in the mining operation. But Marcel himself had survived the underground inferno, though his expensive clothes were now torn and dirty, and his carefully maintained appearance was ruined by smoke dust and the kind of desperation that came from watching life's work disappear in literal flames. He sat slumped against a boulder outside the collapsed mine entrance, his silver hair disheveled and his face gray with the kind of defeat that came from understanding that everything he had built over decades of careful planning had been destroyed in a single night. Yet even in defeat, he maintained the calculating coldness that had made him dangerous. His eyes still held the predatory intelligence that had built an empire on systematic murder, and when he looked at his niece, there was no recognition of shared humanity. Only the cold assessment of a businessman evaluating assets and liabilities. Sheriff Owen, who had been coordinating the surface battle while they fought their desperate escape from the tunnels below, approached with something that would change everything about their legal situation and their ability to prove the scope of Marcel's conspiracy. In his hands was a waterproof document case that had been blown clear during the final explosion, its contents preserved by chance, and the paranoid foresight of criminals who understood the value of insurance against betrayal by business partners or subordinates. Victor kept comprehensive backup records. Owen explained grimly, opening the case to reveal correspondence that made their previous evidence look like amateur documentation of small-scale criminal enterprise. Letters, contracts, payment authorizations, shipping manifests, everything needed to prove Marcel's conspiracy reaches directly into federal offices in Washington and involves officials whose names appear on legislation affecting territorial development throughout the American West. The documents revealed the full scope of Marcel's operation with devastating clarity and meticulous detail that would have impressed legitimate businessmen with its thoroughness and organization. He hadn't just been manipulating territorial conflicts for government contracts. He had been working systematically with federal officials to eliminate native populations through manufactured wars, opening vast territories for development by business partners and political allies, whose investments would generate profits measured in millions of dollars rather than the thousands that had seemed impressive at the territorial level. Names appeared on the correspondence that made Eliza's blood run cold with their implications for American democracy, and the rule of law senators whose votes had authorized military campaigns, federal judges whose rulings had legitimized land seizures, military commanders whose strategic decisions had been influenced by bribes disguised as consulting fees, and territorial governors who had received regular payments in exchange for policies that facilitated systematic extermination disguised as legitimate security operations. Marcel himself remained silent during Owen's examination of the evidence, his eyes still holding the cold calculation that had made him dangerous, even in defeat. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no trace of remorse or recognition that his actions had caused suffering to thousands of innocent people throughout the frontier territories. "You have absolutely no comprehension of what you've destroyed here tonight," he told Eliza with something approaching pity in his tone, as if she were a child who had broken something valuable without understanding its importance. Even now, with his empire in ruins around him, he brushed an imaginary speck of dirt from his ruined sleeve, a gesture that revealed the depth of his disconnection from reality and consequences. The profits from those federal contracts were going to transform this entire territory: schools that would educate frontier children, hospitals that would provide medical care to remote communities, railways that would connect isolated settlements to national markets. all of it funded by systematic murder. Dr. Frederick observed with moral outrage that his injuries had not diminished. All of it funded by necessary population adjustments that would have benefited everyone in the long run. Marcel corrected with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing crop rotation or livestock breeding rather than extermination. Your father never understood that advancement requires difficult choices about resource allocation and demographic management. You're talking about murdering children, Eliza said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of everything she had learned about her uncle's true character. I'm talking about inevitability. Marcel replied without shame or apparent recognition that his words described atrocities rather than economic policies. He adjusted his gold pocket watch with hands that remained steady despite everything he had lost. The question was never whether native populations would be displaced by American expansion. That outcome was determined by superior technology organization and economic systems that primitive societies couldn't match. Sheriff Owen had heard enough justification for mass murder, disguised as rational policy analysis. Marcel René, you're under arrest for conspiracy against the United States, kidnapping, murder treason, and violations of federal law regarding territorial development and Indian affairs. You have the right to remain silent, though anything you say will be used as evidence during your trial. His formal arrest procedure was interrupted by the sound of approaching cavalry, genuine federal troops responding to telegraph messages that had been sent during their underground battle by Owen's deputies, who had remained above ground to coordinate with military authorities. Colonel James Harrison led 2 companies of soldiers who had been tracking Marcel's operation for months without success, following paper trails and financial irregularities that had suggested large-scale corruption without revealing its true scope or the identity of those responsible. The colonel's arrival brought with it the cold efficiency of military justice, mixed with the satisfaction of finally capturing prey that had eluded federal authorities for years. His weathered face showed no emotion as he studied Marcel, but his eyes held the kind of professional interest that suggested this arrest would bring significant career advancement and personal satisfaction. Is this the man responsible for the systematic raids on freight routes throughout Dakota Territory? Colonel Harrison asked, studying Marcel with the professional interest of someone who had spent years investigating crimes that seemed to have no pattern or logic behind their timing and targets. This is the man who orchestrated those raids to justify federal contracts that made him wealthy beyond imagination. Owen replied with grim satisfaction at finally being able to provide answers to questions that had puzzled military investigators for years. Along with systematic kidnapping, human trafficking, and conspiracy with federal officials to commit extermination against native populations throughout multiple territories. The arrest that followed was almost anticlimactic after everything they had survived during the night's violence and underground warfare. Marcel offered no resistance, apparently understanding that his capture marked the end of more than just personal freedom. It represented the collapse of a conspiracy that had taken decades to build and had required the cooperation of hundreds of officials at every level of territorial and federal government. But as the soldiers prepared to transport their prisoner to federal custody for trial in a territorial court that would have proper jurisdiction over his crimes, Marcel made one final attempt to manipulate the situation. Through family connections and emotional appeals that revealed how little he understood the character of his own relatives, or the depth of their moral commitment to justice over personal advantage. "Eliza," he called out, as military shackles were placed around his wrists with the efficiency of soldiers who had performed this procedure many times before. Even in chains, he managed to project an aura of wealth and authority that made his captivity seem temporary and reversible. "You're the only family either of us has left in this world after everything that's happened." He paused, studying her face for some sign that family loyalty might override moral revulsion at his crimes. His eyes held the same calculating coldness that had built an empire on blood, now focused on one last manipulation that might save his life. "I can still make you wealthy beyond your wildest dreams if you're willing to testify that my actions were motivated by legitimate territorial development rather than personal profit." "You murdered my parents." Eliza interrupted her voice, carrying finality that left no room for negotiation, compromise, or the kind of family reconciliation that Marcel apparently still believed might be possible. "You orchestrated my kidnapping, torture, and planned sale into slavery. You've spent years killing innocent children to increase your profit margins and expand your criminal empire." The rejection hit Marcel harder than physical violence might have his carefully constructed composure finally cracking. To reveal the desperate isolation of someone who had spent so many years manipulating others for personal advantage, that he had forgotten how genuine human connections actually worked or why they might matter to people with normal moral development. "You'll regret this choice when you're living in poverty on some subsistence farm," Marcel said with genuine bewilderment at her refusal to prioritize wealth over principle. Even now, with federal shackles around his wrists and his empire in ruins, he couldn't comprehend a worldview that placed moral considerations above financial opportunity. "I'm choosing to be my father's daughter rather than my uncle's accomplice," Eliza replied simply. As the military escort prepared to depart with their prisoner, Colonel Harrison approached Chayton with questions about federal policy toward native populations and the systematic corruption that had been exposed through their investigation. The colonel's interest seemed genuine, rather than bureaucratic, suggesting that some federal officials were committed to honest administration, rather than the kind of profitable corruption that Marcel had exploited for decades. "Your tracking skills and knowledge of this conspiracy have been invaluable to our investigation," Harrison said with professional respect that acknowledged Chayton as an equal rather than a primitive curiosity. "The federal government could use men like you in official positions, territorial scout interpreter for treaty negotiations, consultant on policies affecting relations between different communities. Would you be interested in discussing such opportunities?" "My first responsibility is to my people and my family," Chayton replied carefully, his wounded arm bound, but his dignity intact despite everything he had endured. "But if federal policy genuinely aims toward justice rather than exploitation, then cooperation might be beneficial for everyone involved." 3 months later, as autumn transformed the Dakota Territory landscape into a masterpiece of gold and crimson that promised another harsh winter, but also the eventual return of spring, and the trials concluded with verdicts that satisfied most people's sense that appropriate justice had been achieved through proper legal procedures rather than frontier violence. Marcel René received death by hanging for treason murder and conspiracy against the United States, his execution carried out at Fort Abraham Lincoln, with witnesses from throughout the territory, attending to confirm that his reign of systematic terror had ended permanently and completely. His freight empire was dissolved through federal action, its assets distributed to compensate victims and fund territorial development projects that would benefit everyone, rather than enriching corrupt officials and their criminal partners. Victor Stanislaus, of course, had already received his final judgment beneath the collapsed mine. But federal investigators were able to piece together enough of his operation from surviving records to identify and arrest dozens of subordinates who had participated in kidnapping, trafficking, and the systematic exploitation of both white settlers and native families throughout multiple territories. Sheriff Owen, whose cooperation had proven crucial in exposing the full scope of the conspiracy and gathering evidence that could stand up in federal court, received a presidential commendation and appointment as a special deputy U.S. Marshal for the District of Dakota, with authority to investigate corruption throughout the territorial system and prevent similar operations from taking root in newly organized regions of the American West. His wife Winona, revealed to be Chayton's long-lost sister Ayanna, became his partner in both life and law enforcement, using her knowledge of both cultures to bridge gaps that had previously seemed insurmountable. Dr. Frederick recovered from his injuries with the remarkable resilience that came from 30 years of frontier medicine, though he walked with a permanent limp that served as a daily reminder of his willingness to sacrifice personal safety for moral principle when circumstances demanded such choices. More importantly, his experience of being manipulated through threats against his granddaughter had taught him valuable lessons about the sophisticated methods that criminal organizations use to recruit unwilling accomplices and maintain operational security through intimidation rather than loyalty. The elderly physician established a teaching clinic in Bismarck that became a model for frontier medical education training doctors who carried not just technical skills, but ethical principles to remote communities throughout the American West. His curriculum included specific instruction on recognizing and resisting the kind of coercion that had nearly turned him into an accessory to kidnapping and murder, helping future physicians understand their responsibilities to patients and communities rather than just individual cases. Percy Whitmore's sacrifice was commemorated with a memorial plaque in the Willow Springs courthouse, honoring his final choice to protect innocent victims rather than preserve his own life and family's safety. The inscription read simply, "Redemption is always possible for those willing to pay its price with courage and sacrifice." But the most meaningful changes were personal rather than legal or institutional, affecting individual lives in ways that would echo through generations of families who grew up in a territory where cooperation and mutual respect had replaced the systematic exploitation and manufactured hatred that Marcel's conspiracy had tried to establish as permanent features of frontier society. On a warm afternoon in late September, exactly 3 months after Marcel's execution, Chayton and Eliza stood together outside the newly constructed Willow Springs schoolhouse, watching Noden play with classmates whose diverse backgrounds reflected the community's commitment to equality and integration based on shared humanity rather than racial or cultural divisions. The 8-year-old had processed his traumatic experiences with the remarkable resilience that characterized children who learned early that survival required adapting to rapidly changing circumstances while maintaining core values and family connections that provided stability in an uncertain world. His laughter carried across the schoolyard like music, mixing with the voices of children from various backgrounds who were learning together in ways that would have been impossible under Marcel's vision of territorial development. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke from chimneys and the earthy sweetness of fallen leaves, while the sound of children's voices created a symphony of innocence that seemed to promise better days ahead. Harvest displays decorated store windows throughout town, their abundance serving as testimony to a community that had survived its darkest trial and emerged stronger than before. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Percy hadn't unlocked those chains? Eliza asked, her fingers tracing the scar on her throat where the iron collar had been. If he'd completed his original mission instead of discovering his conscience at the crucial moment when it mattered most. The question hung between them like morning mist over the prairie, carrying weight that went beyond simple speculation about alternative outcomes. Both of them understood that their survival had depended on a chain of events so fragile that a single different choice might have doomed not just them, but hundreds of other potential victims throughout the territory. Percy Whitmore made a choice that saved more lives than he could ever have imagined. Chayton replied thoughtfully, his arm healing well from the wolf attack, but still bearing scars that would mark him for the rest of his life, as someone who had faced genuine danger for the sake of protecting others. The geometric patterns on his restored buckskin jacket caught afternoon sunlight, each symbol representing not just tribal identity, but personal commitment to principles that transcended cultural boundaries. Their conversation was interrupted by Winifred Ashford, who emerged from the schoolhouse with excitement brightening her features and official documents in her hands that represented months of lobbying local authorities for educational reforms that would benefit children throughout the community. Her dress rustled with the crisp efficiency of someone who had spent years fighting bureaucratic battles and had finally achieved victory through persistence and moral clarity. The town council approved our school integration proposal, she announced with satisfaction, that came from winning a difficult political battle against entrenched interests who preferred to maintain educational segregation. Willow Springs School will welcome all children, regardless of racial background, family income, or cultural heritage. It's a small step, but it's our step. As evening approached and families throughout Willow Springs gathered for the harvest celebration that marked another successful agricultural season, despite the violence and uncertainty that had characterized much of the year, Eliza reflected on the iron chain that had once bound her to Victor's wagon wheel like an animal awaiting sale to the highest bidder. That chain now hung transformed above the school entrance, reshaped through community effort and the skilled craftsmanship of the local blacksmith, into a horseshoe that symbolized protection and good fortune rather than bondage and exploitation. The transformation represented more than symbolic victory. It demonstrated the community's commitment to turning painful reminders of past injustices into sources of strength and hope for future generations who would grow up in a territory where such crimes could not flourish in darkness and secrecy. The harvest celebration itself had grown into something that transcended simple agricultural Thanksgiving. Lakota families brought traditional foods and shared stories that had been passed down through generations, while white settlers contributed dishes from their various European backgrounds and memories of communities they had left behind in search of better opportunities. The mixture created something entirely new, a frontier culture that honored the past while building toward a future based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. Torchlight danced across faces that reflected the diversity of the territory's population, while the sound of multiple languages created a harmony that would have been impossible under Marcel's vision of systematic cultural elimination. Children who had been taught to fear each other now played together with the unconscious ease of those who had never learned that differences in appearance or tradition should create barriers between human beings. "There's something I need to tell you about our future," Chayton said, turning to face her with a question in his dark eyes that had been building for weeks as they worked together to rebuild their lives and their community in the aftermath of trauma and revelation. The firelight caught the silver threads that stress and combat had added to his black hair, while the scars from their underground battles served as permanent reminders of how close they had come to losing everything that mattered. Our future together, if you're willing to consider that possibility after everything we've been through. Eliza felt her heartbeat quicken with an emotion that had nothing to do with fear or danger for the first time in months. The warmth that spread through her chest came from hope rather than desperation, from the possibility of building something positive rather than simply surviving whatever fresh horror might emerge from the darkness. Around them, the harvest celebration continued with laughter and music that seemed to promise that their community had truly moved beyond the shadow of Marcel's crimes. "I'm listening," she said simply, her hand finding his, with natural ease that spoke of trust earned through actions rather than words. The calluses on his palm told stories of hard work and honest labor, while the gentle strength of his grip promised protection without possession. "Among my people, marriage partnerships are based on mutual respect, shared goals, and proven ability to face dangers together, rather than romantic feelings alone." Chayton explained carefully his words, carrying the weight of cultural traditions that emphasized practical considerations alongside emotional connections. "We've certainly proven we can survive difficult circumstances as a team, and I believe we share similar values about protecting those who can't protect themselves." As he spoke, the distant sound of drums began to echo across the celebration. their rhythm connecting the present moment to countless generations of ceremonies that had marked important transitions in the lives of his people. The steady beat seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the earth itself, creating a bridge between past and future that made their personal decision part of something larger than individual choice. "Is this a proposal?" Eliza asked with gentle humor, though her heart was beating faster with excitement and nervous anticipation about the possibility of a future that included both personal happiness and continued commitment to the principles that had brought them together. The smell of wood smoke and roasted corn reminded her of autumn evenings in her childhood home, while the sound of multiple languages around them promised a future that would honor all cultures, rather than demanding the elimination of some for the convenience of others. It's a question about whether you'd consider building a life with someone whose cultural background is different from your own. Chayton continued, his voice growing more serious as he acknowledged the social challenges they would face. Knowing that such a choice would mean facing disapproval from people in both communities who don't understand relationships that cross racial boundaries or challenge traditional expectations about marriage and family structure. Eliza's answer came without hesitation, reflecting months of growth and self-discovery that had taught her to value character over convention and courage over comfort. "After watching my own uncle try to murder me for profit, I think I've learned that character matters more than bloodlines, and courage matters more than social approval from people who prioritize tradition over justice." The words hung between them like a bridge spanning two worlds, carrying promises that extended far beyond personal commitment to include dedication to the kind of community they had fought to create, one where differences in background became sources of strength rather than reasons for conflict. As if summoned by their decision, Sheriff Owen and his wife approached through the crowd, their faces reflecting the contentment of people who had found their way back to each other, despite circumstances that had seemed insurmountable. Ayanna moved with the quiet grace of someone who had survived terrible ordeals, but had emerged with her spirit intact, while Owen carried himself with the confidence of a lawman whose authority rested on genuine respect rather than fear or corruption. "We wanted to thank you both." Owen said, his weathered face reflecting genuine gratitude rather than official politeness. "What you did exposing Marcel's operation, saving those children, proving that justice was still possible in this territory. It gave us hope when we thought everything decent had been destroyed by greed and systematic cruelty. And we wanted to invite you to our own wedding celebration next month." Ayanna added her voice, carrying the musical quality of someone who had learned to speak multiple languages fluently. "It seems appropriate that couples who found each other through shared struggle should celebrate together, creating new traditions that honor both of our peoples, while looking toward a future that belongs to neither exclusively." As music began playing in the distance, and voices rose in celebration of another successful harvest season despite everything they had endured, Chayton and Eliza walked hand in hand toward a community that had been transformed by their refusal to accept that evil was stronger than good, that corruption was inevitable in frontier society, or that people of different backgrounds couldn't work together for common goals that benefited everyone rather than just the wealthy and powerful. The stars emerged one by one in the clear Dakota sky, bearing witness to lives redeemed and a territory made better through ordinary people who had found extraordinary courage when circumstances demanded moral choices that would define their characters forever and determine the kind of future they would create for their children and their children's children. Behind them, carved into the granite memorial that marked the site of Victor's final defeat and the end of Marcel's criminal empire, words promised that their struggle would not be forgotten by future generations. When faced with the choice between safety and conscience, they chose conscience. When faced with the choice between comfort and courage, they chose courage. When faced with the choice between looking away and standing up for the innocent, they stood up. Their wedding would take place the following spring, in a ceremony that combined Lakota traditions with Christian elements, symbolizing not just personal union, but the possibility of different communities working together based on mutual respect and shared commitment to principles that transcended racial and cultural boundaries. The celebration would mark not just the beginning of their life together, but the continuation of changes that had begun with Percy Whitmore's decision to unlock a chain and trust a desperate young woman with information that would expose corruption reaching into the highest levels of American government. The iron chain that had once symbolized bondage and exploitation would serve as the raw material for their wedding rings, transformed through fire and skilled craftsmanship into circles of commitment that would honor the struggles of the past while promising hope for the future. In the hands of the community's blacksmith himself, a former soldier who had learned that beating swords into plowshares was more than biblical metaphor, the metal would be purified and reshaped into symbols of unity that carried the weight of history, while pointing toward possibilities that Marcel's cynical worldview had never been able to imagine. As they stood together under the vast Dakota sky, watching children play games that mixed traditions from multiple cultures, while parents shared stories and food that represented the best of frontier hospitality, Eliza and Chayton understood that they had become part of something larger than individual survival or even personal happiness. They had become witnesses to the possibility that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, could choose courage over comfort and justice over personal advantage. The future spread before them like the endless prairie itself, vast, uncertain, full of both promise and peril, but no longer dominated by the systematic cruelty that had once seemed inevitable. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, armed with the knowledge that even in the darkest circumstances, the human capacity for goodness could triumph over the most sophisticated evil, if people were willing to pay the price that redemption demanded. In the distance, the sound of drums continued to echo across the celebration, their rhythm carrying forward the voices of ancestors who had known their own struggles against injustice, while promising that the fight for human dignity would continue through future generations who would inherit both the scars and the victories of those who had refused to surrender their humanity in the face of systematic oppression. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns that had guided travelers for countless generations, their ancient light bearing witness to one more chapter in the endless human story of people choosing to stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost, because they understood that some principles were worth more than individual survival, and that the future belonged to those brave enough to fight for it when their moment of testing arrived.